For my last teaching round, I was placed at Alphington Grammar School, and I actually really enjoyed my time at this school, so I'm glad to get the chance to share a couple of those experiences with you here now. One of the first lessons I taught at Alphington Grammar was for a Year 11 biology class, and this particular lesson was actually planned by my mentor, who had wanted to use it as a way of wrapping up the unit they had covered in the weeks just before I arrived. The unit they had just covered was on the reproductive system, and at this point they were focusing on the reproduction parts of plants. So the first lesson I took over for was a flower dissection, and basically what the students had to do was dissect 3 different types of flowers in order to identify the different reproductive parts of plants and also to review the different methods of pollination, so for example through wind, insects, and animals like birds. The lesson sounded good on paper, but it just didn't play out the way I would have liked. And now that I think about it, I know there were a few reasons for why I don't think the lesson went as well as it could have. In the first place, I just don't think I had really thought the lesson through well enough myself. I guess because my mentor had said he had given the students the information about the prac and already covered the information they would need to know in the previous lessons, I had assumed that they would be more prepared than the way they were. Another problem was that I had to round up the plans for the dissection pretty much at the last minute since I had just been given the prac and was expected to teach it the next day. And what's shown here are actually some of the examples of a few of the plants I used. These particular plants were examples of the wind-pollinated plants, which you can tell by the lack of petals and light feathery stamens. And these are flowers I used to represent insect-pollinated plants, which are generally small and have brightly colored petals to attract insects. I didn't have a problem getting a hold of examples of wind and insect-pollinated plants because I was able to just pick them from a nearby park, but the animal-pollinated plants were harder for me to come by on such short notice, so I ended up ringing my mentor that night, and he said he'd just pick some from his garden and bring them in the morning. So I thought, yeah, that's great, that's settled. But actually that turned into another separate problem, which I'll address a little later. So the time for the lesson came, and to start out, I just gave a brief overview of the prac, explaining things like how to cut each flower and what to look for, and then pretty much I just set the students off. As it turned out, several problems came up during the lesson. First of all, the students apparently hadn't read any of the information they had been taught in previous lessons, and so I ended up needing to remind each group about the different plant structures and had to give hints as to what they needed to look for and what they might look like and where they would be located on different types of plants. Also, they didn't read any of the directions or listen to what I had said about getting one of each different type of plant, and instead some groups only had one plant and other groups had 3 of the same type of plant, and this led to not having enough of one type of plant to go around, since one of the groups had pretty much destroyed several while trying to figure out what to do. Their not listening or reading directions had also led to confusions when it came time to write their reports. I had said in the beginning, and it was stated throughout the instructions, that it was important to record certain characteristics about each of the plants, things like texture and smell, but for some reason many of the students didn't write this information down as they went along and therefore struggled with the data and discussion sections of the reports later on. Now, like I mentioned a minute ago, another problem came up with regards to the types of plants we had available to dissect. Well, the plants my mentor ended up bringing in were actually orchids, like the one shown here. Unfortunately, this turned out to be a poor example for a couple of reasons. For one, I only still needed an example of a flower which is pollinated by birds, but what I didn't realize until after the lesson was that orchids are actually not pollinated by birds at all. Some are self-pollinated, while others are usually pollinated by bees. So our model of a bird-pollinated flower to include in the lab write-up was basically thrown out the window. The other problem I really struggled with throughout the lesson was correctly identifying certain reproductive structures of the orchid. The diagram shown here is a general example of the structures we were looking for. As you can see, the stigma, or the female reproductive parts of the plant, are clearly separate from the anther, or the male reproductive structures of the plant. With the orchid, we were able to identify things like the petals and the pollen easily enough, but I wasn't exactly sure about where the stigma or anther were. Of course, the students picked up on my uncertainty, and I felt like they were probably questioning my degree of content knowledge, which was fair enough because I was too at that point. So my level of confidence was really starting to drop. But fortunately, I wasn't shattered, and as soon as I got a chance, I did some research on orchids. I found a diagram like the one here, and I showed it to the students the following lesson. As you can see, orchids are unique in that the stigma and the anther are actually attached on the central column, and this new information was really helpful to clear things up. I also explained the misunderstanding about the orchids being examples of bird-pollinated plants, which I think the students appreciated when it came time to write their reports. So despite all of the things that went wrong, that confusing lesson was a really great learning experience for me. It made me realize how much preparation goes into planning a prac, and that it's best done several days in advance. I also became aware of the need to go over instructions and previously mentioned information both clearly and in detail just before and throughout the activity. And finally, I understand how imperative it is for teachers to really know their stuff about what it is they're teaching.